not only were they not supported in that room, but when the union got mad enough by what the chapter manager was doing, the only way he'd resolve it is if the chapter manager was gone.
All right, so we're back again, another recording of our podcast. And for those of you that decided to listen to our Letters of Ascent podcast, I'm just going to go ahead and reveal a backstage secret here. Sometimes Chuck and I record these on the same day because Chuck doesn't leave Father Christmas up there up year round. At least I don't think you do. Do you, Chuck?
No.
Okay,
no.
yeah. So
He just magically appears this time of year. Yeah. There's not much you can do about it.
And Chuck did offer to take down Father Christmas, so we can get a little variety, or maybe provide a different feel for the podcast. But I was nervous about doing that because I myself am trying to stay on the nice list. So I asked Chuck to keep Father Christmas up there. So hope you're listening there, buddy. But today, if you notice, we have another special guest. Mr. Zach Cassett is joining us today. Zach, say hi.
Hello, everybody.
So, Zach comes to us today with some questions that he wants to be able to ask Chuck, and I'm going to do my best to maybe answer some of them and chime in as well. We haven't told Chuck everything that he may ask, and I've told Zach he has free reign. Ask whatever you want. Zach, I wouldn't say ask for Social Security's numbers or anything. I've tried. He won't tell me. Maybe keep it to labor relations topics. But for those of you listening and watching, the whole point of this podcast is Zach is new. He obviously doesn't have the amount of experience that Chuck brings to the table. So he's going to ask questions that some of us may think are, obvious or we should know the answer to. But what you're going to find is some of these questions he's asked, maybe you haven't even thought of it that way. Or there's a chance that Chuck or myself are going to answer it and provide you with information that you didn't know, that you weren't expecting. So instead of listening to me ramble on, why don't I just let Zach jump in? Zach, you got questions? Hopefully we got answers.
Well, Ron, we enjoy hearing you. And I have a list of questions for Chuck today. They're going to be jumping left and right at touching every subject. So
that's good.
Keep that in mind. So I'll start with some kind of big questions is, as a new chapter manager, what are you seeing? There's some common labor relation mistakes they've made that, that are completely avoidable.
I think the most common error is to take on some labor relations issue without fully understanding the history or impact of what you're doing. I've seen chapter managers who listen to a couple of members who are boisterous about a problem they have with the union, and the manager deciding, well, that's something we need to fix. I would caution you that when you get into a chapter, if you do arrive as the new chapter manager rather than an assistant, because the situation is much different there. But if you become the chapter manager, spend some time with the field representative who's assigned to your chapter and ask him about labor relations in that chapter. Ask him about the business manager. What do you know about the business manager? What do you know about the relationships between this contractor or any of the contractors and the the business manager? Because sometimes what you find is a particular contractor has a bad relationship with the business manager because of something that happened years ago, and he has invented these labor relations problems that he wants you as the chapter manager to fix for him, which is just going to put you in the middle, and it's not something the rest of the membership wants you to do anyway. Ryan, do you have any comments?
Not on that one, because you pretty well hit exactly what I would have said there. Not knowing the lay of the land first before you try to tackle anything would be one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen made. I guess a way to summarize that one, or just because you are the chapter representative doesn't mean that the employers are always going to side with your way of thinking. And you're wrong to go in and think that. I learned that the hard way going into a grievance. I thought I was right, and I thought my employers were going to back me, and they didn't. You have to understand that, and I still actually hold in that case I was right contractually, but that's where you get into that whole past practice thing, and the employers said, no, this is the way we want to interpret it. This is the way we've always interpreted it. And as an inexperienced chapter manager, what I failed to do was to vet this or have this discussion with my employers. As a new incoming manager, you need to know the lay of the land. Talk to your field rep. Talk to all the contractors independently. Get an idea of what's happening.
And this isn't just an academic exercise, or you might be embarrassed by something. Chapter managers have lost their jobs because they tackled the wrong issue. And not only were they not supported in that room, but when the union got mad enough by what the chapter manager was doing, the only way he'd resolve it is if the chapter manager was gone. I guess one other mistake that managers sometimes make: don't look down on the business manager because he used to work with the tools. First of all, to be a good electrician, you have to be pretty smart. But a lot of these guys are very skilled in what they do. They've been doing it a long time, and they're very political. That's how they get elected. So don't come in thinking, I went to the Ohio State University or some other fine school, and I can put this guy in his place at any time. First, that's a bad way to start off a relationship, and often it's not true. Some of these business managers are very good at what they do.
And that's, I guess, another piece of advice that I would give, since we're talking about the business managers, is not only not look down to them, but don't neglect that relationship.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes, regardless of what your employer's relationship is with the business manager, that needs to be mutually exclusive from your relationship. You have to be able to work with that individual. You have to have some form of trust with that individual. So from day one, you need to be building that.
Yeah, and as is typical with these podcasts, we can spend the whole time now on this first question here, but the relationship part of it is in the top three of your questions. Ryan was saying you have to build a relationship, or at least try. Some of these guys aren't going to want to have a relationship with you. You're not going to be friends or even friendly, but you've got to have some level of respect.
So just basically treat it like any other relationship you have. That should be important. Treat them as a person.
Yeah. Now, you may run into an age difference when you come and somebody's been business manager for 20 or 30 years. The last thing he wants is to have some kid tell him how he's supposed to run his industry.
A fun one to ask them, and we'll move on from this one after this so you can get to the rest of your list there, Zach. But I found a way, because I was in that situation where I was a young chapter manager dealing with business managers who had much more experience and years in the industry than I did. I found a good way to get them to open up and share those kinds of things. I would always be walking through the hall, and most, if not all, unions have like a copy of like their original agreement or something with some of the original signatory contractors on it. And I would always ask them to tell me about that, tell me what history they knew about the local, because you'd be amazed at how many tangents they go off on when they're telling you that history. Much like Chuck and I, when we're going through a topic, we go off on this road and this road, but that business manager will share a lot for you in telling you that story of how the local, got to where it was that day.
So Chuck, you've been in many CIR cases and been involved in that for a long time now. So I'll make this a two-part question. Is number one, tips you have for people for the chapter going to CIR, and number two is common mistakes not only made by NECA but also the labor side of what happens at CIR.
It's a two-part question, so I'll try to keep this down to an 8-part answer. Actually, right now, because of COVID and our Zoom CIR sessions, council presentations are changed dramatically from what they were. And it's interesting to see what has transpired in the last year. It's easier sometimes to tell you what not to do when you come to council than tell you how to do it. But you need to be clear on what you want and why you want it and why your solution to whatever the issue is, whether it's negotiations or a grievance, is the better solution. You need to know pretty much everything about the issues. And sometimes you have to be not so fixed on getting what you want that you don't take the opportunity to get something better. And we do see that at CIR where the chapter comes into negotiations and they're fixed on getting one thing. Throughout the negotiations, they won't entertain any other solution except the one thing they want to get. They don't get that, they don't settle, they have to come to CIR, and they're probably not going to get it there either. Years ago, I did a presentation on the do's and don'ts of going to CIR. I started with a don't come, because the best solutions are local solutions. You're not going to really be happy with what happens at CIR. Both sides cannot be happy with it. But as I was saying, you need to be fully prepared. One of the failings, I think, chapters get insular when they're in bargaining and they don't reach out to other chapters around them to find out how their negotiations went. If they settled at home, what was the settlement? Did you get anything from the union in exchange for that? There may be a big settlement in the local union next door, but it's a different chapter. If that's happened, you need to know why the other chapter gave that much money, because a lot of times it was tied to something else. I'm not saying you're going to get that, but when the local says these guys next door got a 5% wage increase, that holds some influence on the committee. If you're not able to say they got a 5% increase, that's true, but in exchange, we got a better ratio of CWs and CEs on the job. We got something in exchange for giving them that increase. If you don't know those things, then it just looks like, well, they can afford 5% next door. Why can't you?
I'll wrap up the question with just some couple of tips from my perspective and me sitting there and things that I've seen. Obviously, know your time limits because they are there now. It doesn't look like they're going anywhere. Chapter managers, practice your oral presentation and your rebuttal if you want to script it with your field rep. Make sure you're number one in your time limit, but let your field rep give you that constructive criticism. Does it make sense? Does it provide all the information? When you have specific asks of the council, if it's language, tell us exactly what language you want. And to your brief, remember that brief is a noun and an adjective. A 100-page brief or a 150-page brief does not guarantee you a better settlement than a 5-page brief. Check your submission forms. Make sure they're accurate. A lot of times the local fills them out and you as the chapter manager just signs them. Before you sign it, give it a once over. Make sure the numbers are right. Make sure everything makes sense on it. Make sure there's no inaccuracies. I can't tell you how many I've found. Don't start writing your brief at or after the interim. I'm not trying to encourage anybody or everybody to always be CIR bound. I agree 100% with Chuck. The best CIR settlement is to settle it at home. Every negotiation, every grievance has the potential to go to CIR. Start your brief after the first negotiation meeting. You may never use it, but if you're going to try to do that mad dash, right after that interim meeting, what is it, a week or two sometimes, or even a couple of days before the submission deadlines of council, and you're trying to sum up however many hours of negotiations and you're doing it at 11 o'clock at night, at night sitting at your office, you're going to miss something, you're going to have mistakes, or you're going to tend to ramble. Start it early, write it all down, just start building your brief. That way, all you have to do is update it if you have to come to CIR. And if you never use any of them, at least you're really good at writing CIR briefs.
Don't wait. And the other thing is the error of recency, or whatever you might call it. If you wait until after your interim, you may forget things. You're only going to remember what was discussed at interim. And don't be too concerned about what the union's putting in their brief. You're not writing a rebuttal. You're writing your brief, presenting your arguments in the best light possible. You'll get a little time for rebuttal at the session.
How did the 1976 National Agreement come to be? I know that's where Category 1 language came from. How did that, what's the whole story on that?
Actually, it was very simple. Up until 1976, the contribution rate to the National Electrical Benefit Fund was 1%. The IBEW wanted a higher contribution rate so they could have a more meaningful benefit to offer their members. They came to, since it's a national program, the International came to National NECA and said, we want to change this. We want to raise the contribution from 1% to 3% of gross labor payroll. And NECA's response wasn't, get out of here, that'll never happen. It was, well, okay, there's some things we want too. So let's have a discussion. And that's how it came about. The union wanted something, we wanted something, and bargaining commenced. And out of the national agreement, although all those individual pieces became Category 1, the intent wasn't to create Category 1. It was just to solve this one negotiations raising the contribution rate to NABF in exchange for a 1 apprentice for every 3 journeyman ratio, because there had been no defined ratio on jobs or in shops. The shift clause, the National Electrical Industry Fund, which we subsequently lost, some changes to what was known as the incremental pension plan, which has since gone away. What was the
Portability?
Yeah, the portability, raising it from 1 individual to 4. And
What about standard CIR language?
standard CIR language was not part of the national agreement. Standard CIR, it came about from the 1920s. After the First World War, there was high inflation, there was labor unrest, strikes were common. It was so bad in construction that one trade would go out on strike, which would virtually shut down the project. That would get settled, and then another trade would go on strike. Nothing much was getting done, and 2 individuals, Charles Ford and L.K. Comstock. Charles Ford was the international secretary of the IBEW, and Comstock was a contractor. Started having discussions about how do we fix this, and they came up with the idea that became the Council on Industrial Relations. And they put it together, they sold it to both parties. The IBEW adopted it. The original negotiations or discussions were between the IBEW and a group called the Conference Group, or the Conference Club maybe at that time. But it was a group of large electrical contractors. What they eventually, most of them were NECA members anyway, and they decided it would be more appropriate to have NECA as the other party to these negotiations and the development of the CIR. So they did. This was all just about 100 years ago when all this was going on. And they were able to create the Council on Industrial Relations and set up mandatory binding arbitration. It eventually became required of all local unions, or all local union and NECA chapter agreements, and available to other agreements. And of course, there's always a few outliers, just like in referral. There were some areas of the country that already had an arbitration program. So they weren't required to adopt CIR, but by and large, everybody else was. And for quite a while, that was all there was. Then in the 1970s, a lot of stuff happened in the 1970s. A resolution passed at the IBEW's International Convention that would allow a local union to opt out of full CIR and give them back the ability to strike over wages. So that passed. We reluctantly agreed because the law was in favor of that. And in those areas, they now have what we call modified CIR, where their wage negotiations can come to CIR if they both agree. But if they don't both agree to come to CIR, then either side can take economic action, strikes or lockouts. But all their grievances still come to CIR.
So Chuck, when it comes to 8F and 9A, how could you give me like an overview version of what each of those versions do and how they affect our members?
Okay, what's the difference between an 8F relationship and a 9A relationship? Essentially, it has to do with terminating your relationship with the union. An employer who has been converted or even initially established as a 9A contractor under the traditional meaning of the law, because the employees have chosen of their own free will to be represented by the union, the law imposes an obligation on that contractor to continue to bargain with the union even after an agreement expires, because that was the employee's choice and they want to protect that choice. If an employer has been organized under Section 8F, he doesn't have a legal obligation to bargain after the expiration of the contract. He may have a contractual obligation because of the way the language in the agreement is written to continue to bargain, but he doesn't have a statutory one. If an 8F employer is operating under, say, a modified CIR clause, and he wants to terminate his relationship with the union, he would first withdraw by sending a letter of assent to the chapter and the local union and say, I want to leave the bargaining unit and I want to terminate my agreement with the local union. The local union will then engage that employer in negotiations for a subsequent agreement. If those negotiations fail, then at any point after the termination of that agreement, either party, the employer or the union, can send a 10-day notice to the other party and say, I want to terminate the agreement. At that point, after the 10 days, the union can strike. Well, if the employer gives the notice, the union can strike immediately. If the employer gives the notice, he has to wait 10 days, then he could lock out the union or impose his last best offer. If the employer has been converted to a 9A or started as a 9A, the first part of that process is the same. He notifies the chapter and the local union that he's withdrawing from the chapter's bargaining unit. He notifies the union that he wants to terminate his relationship with the union. He doesn't want another agreement. The union will then engage him in negotiations under a successor agreement, towards a successor agreement. If they haven't settled by the expiration of that current contract, the employer is still required to bargain by law with the union. Depending on what happens, the union goes on strike, the employer is free to hire replacement workers. Once he's hired enough replacement workers, although he can't assume they don't want to be represented by the union, if they have manifested that they don't want to be employed by or represented by the union, then he can, at that point, notify the union that he doesn't recognize them anymore. And then the union can try to get either authorization cards or have another election. Within the context of the NECA IBEW relationship, because of most are under CIR, even an 8F employer can be compelled to go to CIR and get a successor agreement. We're asked often by employers, the union has sent us this authorization letter. They say they want to convert us from 8F to 9A. Should we do it? Our answer is it's up to you, but you're never going to see any impact from it by agreeing. This comes up infrequently, but every now and then the IBEW will notify their local unions that they should do this.
When I think about if there's a contractor, he's a 9A, he's letter of percent A. If he wants to leave, he has to put the notification become letter of percent B.
No,
Correct? No?
no. He has to put in notification that he wants to cancel his letter of assent, withdraw the chapter's authorization to act as his bargaining representative. He can include in that letter or send a separate letter that says he wants to terminate his relationship with the union, but it doesn't change his signatory status from 8F to 9A or back.
Now, if I sign up, let's say I sign up a small non-union contractor to come in, so they're going to be a NECA employer and be the IBEW. When they sign the letter of percent A, does that automatically make them a 9A?
No.
They're going to be 8F.
They will sign, yes, they will be 8F when they sign that. Now, there's a notation in the letter of assent, and a lot of times in our agreement, there's language that says the employer also agrees it will recognize the union as the 9A representative of the union when the union achieves majority status within the workforce. Essentially, it's an attempt at automatic conversion. It's not effective in making that conversion, although it says the employer agrees to recognize the union. That doesn't happen. But what has happened is the employer now has an obligation that when the union comes calling and makes the show of cards to say that you can't just turn them away and you will sign that authorization.
So, Zach, just to put kind of a bow on your question of 8F versus 9A, it's probably easy to summarize it as 9A is where it started. 9A were the employees choosing to be represented by a union. The construction industry, both employers and the union, saw that this didn't necessarily fit their needs. So they went to Congress. Congress agreed and created the 8F arrangement in which the employer is choosing which union to represent them. As far as in our industry, especially with our contracts and our language, 8F and 9A are not extremely impactful. Where we as chapter managers get involved is when the question is asked from the employer, hey, the union has asked me to sign this form to become a 9A. Response typically is, it's not going to have a major impact on your business day to day. And we then go into explaining all of the headache that can be involved if they challenge that, because the union can compel such a relationship, through the election process, which is onerous in itself. So it's usually just easier for the employer to sign it because it's not going to impact them day to day. But in short, 9A employees chose which union to represent them. 8F, the employer chose the union. Under a 9A relationship, there is a statutory obligation to bargain outside of the contractual obligations that we have in our industry. And under 8F, there is no statutory obligation to bargain. Since I have Chuck listening to every word I'm saying here, sound about right, Chuck?
Yeah.
So, okay, well then that's all the stamp of approval I need on that one. Zach, Chuck, I want to thank you guys both for being on the podcast today. Zach, thanks for coming up with such awesome questions for Chuck. I've learned things just sitting here listening, and said at the beginning, we can have somebody brand new asking questions that we all think we know the answer to. And, I learned listening to them. So Zach, thank you for that. Chuck, always thank you for your knowledge. Father Christmas sitting over Chuck's shoulder there. Thank you in advance for that Lamborghini if and when you decide to deliver it. But in all seriousness, thank you guys so much for doing this. Everybody listening at home, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you guys next time.